Never, never take for granted what they fought for.
These women started with no power and affected the single largest change to American democracy.
The cultural pushback about whether this was appropriate behavior was huge.
It's a real study in perseverance.
It never got the kind of attention that would make you understand what a daring thing these women did and how much it meant not only this country but the world.
Seneca Falls is often heralded as the beginning of the women's suffrage movement because it was the first organized convention. It was held in 1848 in upstate New York. It was led by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott. The most controversial resolution out of all of them was about women's right to vote. And the resolution carried, and it was included in the document.
Women get suffrage in the West long before they ever get it in the East. It really is like a wave moving from the West to the East.
It's no accident that it was big empty states out West that were enfranchising women first. They had very few residents. They were enfranchising everybody to maximize their political power. It wasn't that they were somehow more woke about feminism.
During the Progressive era, say the last quarter of the 1800s, they banded together, had tea parties and women's clubs, and they took on issues like prison reform, school reform, the beginning of the national parks movement, but at the same time training themselves in how to organize.
It was a very segregated period, and women, particularly African-American women, were coming together as a nexus of like minds. I have to go back and admire Mary Church Terrell. She came with a strong background, a lot of culture, very broad-minded.
The National Association of Colored Women was founded by several women. Mary Church Terrell was one of the founders, along with my great-grandmother, Ida B. Wells, in order to create one national organization for Black women.
The movement itself, like a lot of movements, changed over time, and who was for what and when and so forth evolved over those 72 years. So there were some different dynamics in the 1800s than by the time you got into the 1900s.
You have to see it as 3 generations of leadership. Stanton, Anthony Stone, early. Then you have an interim period where Anthony has recruited the next generation, people like Carrie Chapman Catt and Anna Howard Shaw. And then this 3rd generation shows up, these young women, Alice Paul, Lucy Burns. They're all in their 20s, and they take different approaches.
The 1913 suffrage parade was an extraordinary production on so many levels, announcing in this very public way that women's suffrage was important on a federal level was really transgressive in 1913.
Although the leadership was primarily, white upper-class women, there were many other women of color working in their own ways.
They formed this whole new group, Delta Sigma Theta Sorority, with a service purpose. And it was a suffragette had come to the campus, and she told them they had a double reason for being in the parade. First of all, you're girls, you're women, and then because of your race, you need to be there. So that inspired them.
My great-grandmother refused to march in the back of the parade and inserted herself into the front and center of the Illinois delegation.
In the pictures from that day, it's absolutely shoulder to shoulder. And what you can see is a whole lot of bowler hats. Those were men. They weren't there for the suffrage parade. They were there for the Wilson inauguration the next day.
They threw tomatoes and they yelled epithets and all of that, and it really broke down. People were injured, people were arrested. And while Alice Paul would not have condoned the violence, she immediately saw that this was a public relations opportunity.
That a perfect parade would be in the news for a day, and a mob trying to stop the suffragists from expressing their rights was going to keep the suffrage cause in the news for weeks.
Outdoor tactics, what they referred to as outdoor tactics, the marching, the picketing, the being much more visible in the press, brought in younger women, and that was important. But no protest movement works if it doesn't have direction, if it doesn't have an agenda. And Kat supplied that.
These dramatic moments in history are crystallizing, and they're incredibly important. But in and of themselves, if there aren't people who leave there and go back to somewhere, their local government, their county board, and change the system, that won't be enough.
People opposed suffrage for a lot of different reasons. Some of it was just garden variety sexism. That's just sort of women are too stupid and fragile to handle the vote. Some of it was economics. There were industries that employed child labor that really didn't want women to vote.
Another category of women were wealthy women because they had privilege. They'd married money, they had influence over their husbands. These were not women who were going to be dumped.
These anti-suffrage women really feared an upheaval of the social order, that everything they held dear, everything they said was important, would be thrown out the window because women who wanted to vote were denigrating their values.
Certainly, another contingent of women who are opposed to suffrage were opposed to it because they did not want the enfranchisement of all women, including African American women. So there's certainly a racial component to this, particularly, as you might imagine, in the southern states.
It's important, I think, also to point out that it was a movement of women and men who supported the full enfranchisement of women in opposition to women and men who did not.
When Inez Mulholland collapsed at a suffrage event at age 30, she was mythologized. And to honor her, women initially marched around the White House, and out of that came the idea of the silent sentinels, which were the suffragists who simply stood outside the White House gates in morning, noon, and night.
I think contemporary activists think they invented everything. The pickets in front of the White House, of course that was making a political point, but how striking are those images? You know, women in dark coats against the White House with these very easy to read sans serif font banners that look great in newspaper photographs. That is the functional equivalent, the 1917 equivalent of taking a message viral.
They were not going to be discouraged, and so they became, in Wilson's mind, a nuisance. And so that began the sort of the sporadic arrests, and those arrests got a lot more serious.
Women had been sent down here to Occoquan beginning in the summer of 17 because the president had decided he had enough. They were beaten, abused, stripped, so the women began hunger strikes. As they were tied down, shackled down, and the tube went down their throat, no nourishment came to their body because they immediately vomited up bile, blood, gruel.
One night in the jail, the night that they dubbed it the Night of Terror, a warden, Whitaker, and his men had finally had it with all these suffragists, and they were really brutalizing them. They tied Lucy Burns' hands up over her head and kept her that way all night.
By morning, she had almost suffocated because she could not breathe. It was a horrific experience. The women became weaker and weaker, and pretty soon, Whitaker realized he was going to have martyrs on his hands.
When finally the White House realized that this was a public relations battle they were never going to win, they ordered all the women released.
When all of this got out and went around the world, that was a public humiliation for Wilson. While this was going on, of course, Carrie Chapman Catt is continuing her work. And in January, Wilson went before Congress and gave his support to an amendment giving women the right to vote.
After that, even some of the most troglodyte women can't handle the vote members of Congress realized that it was probably inevitable. And so a lot of minds suddenly magically changed.
And it passed the House, it didn't pass the Senate. It was always the Senate that was the problem. Every 6 months or so it was brought up. Finally, it passed by 2 votes, and then the ratification process started.
And Catt says, we're going for this, we're going to vote in 1920. And she has troops on the ground. Every state had a NASA chapter. Some states were very eager to ratify. Michigan was the first, others came right in line. And I think it's just remarkable that within 12 months, they had 35 states. And you needed 3/4, so that would have been 36.
They just set on Tennessee as being the best hope.
The Tennessee Senate was very much in favor, and so it just moved right through. Then it got to the House, and that was the sticky wicket. And so they had the legislators there who stood up, and you could tell right away which side they were on by the rose that they were wearing on their lapel. And Harry Bryn stood up, and as he stood up, he took off his red rose and put on a yellow rose as he said, yay, and passed the amendment.
Harry Bryn doesn't appear until the next day at a press conference where he pulls a letter from his mother out of his pocket, says, "Dear Harry, I want you to support Mrs. Catt, help Mrs. Catt put the rat in ratification." And Harry, who's 24, a Republican from East Tennessee, says, "I know that a boy should always pay attention to his mother." So he changed his vote.
It's quite empowering, I think, to really understand that all those people worked together, even though sometimes they were doing it differently, under that umbrella cause, and it succeeded. I think that is really a good example for a lot of work that's going on today.
Careful reading of the amendment says that the right to vote cannot be abridged by any state on account of sex. So that only meant that states who had complete control over who got to vote lost one reason to discriminate against women. It didn't mean that they didn't have lots of other reasons that they could keep women from voting, and they did.
Even after the 19th Amendment was ratified, African American women and Native American women did not have the whole privilege. They had to go through poll tests. They had to go through literary tests.
We should commemorate it. We should teach about it. But it didn't include all 27 million eligible American women. But it made a start, and some of those women took the vote and used it. Some did not, and some really had impact on legislation and action. It would take a long time until women really had the impact they have today.